This is an old TV show. If anybody has ever heard of Flight of the Conchords. It's a classic. The distant future. All right, let's get started. I need to look through your video feeds to see if anyone else is dressed up. We're having a contest at the end of the lecture, so if you're not dressed up, go get dressed up. $75 on the line. Oh, I see Raymond has one. Nice. Aislinn, looking good. Barbara, looking good. All right. Everyone else looking good that's wearing a costume. I can't look through everyone. Nice, Danielle, looking good. Don's costume takes the cake, totally. He's got the background to go along with it. All right. So how are we feeling about testing? I know there was a lot of frustration. If you have any specific questions, let's get them posted in Slido. Wanda asks, is The Nightmare Before Christmas a Halloween or a Christmas movie? That is a very important question. I think I would consider it, let's consider it a Thanksgiving movie because it's between Halloween and Christmas. It's a Thanksgiving movie. That's the official answer. Can you go over the debug function inside testing again? What was the code for? Something.debug. Yeah, sure. Okay, so in our dog website, we make sure these tests pass. So inside of our test, if we ever call wrapper.debug, all that's going to do is it's going to log out our component tree to the console so that we can see like what exactly got rendered. So if we call wrapper.debug and then we run our test, we get this visual representation of our component tree that was rendered. So it helps us visually look at it and see what's actually getting rendered versus just having no idea. Okay, that's what the wrapper.debug does. Last night's project was really confusing compared to the guided project we did. Is backend really that confusing? No. I think the confusion comes from just badly worded phrases and badly organized expectations. The concepts, I think the concepts themselves are not that bad. So once you get the concepts down, you can kind of just start seeing the actual use cases in real code, then stuff starts to make a lot more sense. When you get to backend, especially with testing, when you don't have to worry about like testing a virtual DOM, you don't have to worry about rendering a virtual DOM, testing becomes actually a lot easier. So if you're frustrated with testing right now, just know that once you get to the back end and you start testing stuff that actually matters, that's when testing will get a lot easier and it'll make more sense as to why you're actually doing it. Okay. But don't worry, backend is actually really fun. I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. It's a whole different world. It's a whole different ballgame. You're going to learn a lot of new concepts, and you'll probably forget a lot of the stuff that you've learned from front end. I'm not saying front-end testing doesn't matter. I'm saying back-end testing is more important. So a lot of the times you'll have testing on the back end. If you're building a full stack application, building your back-end tests are going to take priority over front-end tests. But testing in general is obviously very important. So if you're working on a team that has a dedicated back-end engineer and a dedicated front-end engineer, then yeah, you're going to have to write front-end tests, and it's going to matter in that case. Any drawbacks to using something like Cypress instead of like React testing? Cypress is actually a service. It's a managed service that costs money. So if you want to use Cypress, then you have to sign up for their plan and use their actual service. So it's not quite the same as using like an open source library to test your code. You don't have any control over it. You just kind of use it. And it works really well, but a lot of people don't like to depend on other services like that, especially for something so essential as testing. So it's a good service, but it's not the same. It's not open source. You have to sign up and pay for it. So which library should we emphasize some extra learning on? Enzyme, Cypress? Yeah, I mean, if you want to learn Enzyme, that kind of just does the same thing as React testing library. So if you want to learn something that's more service-based and easier to use, but not quite as flexible or customizable, then yeah, you could learn something like Cypress. Yeah, as long as you're getting tests written, that's the most important thing. If I have 100 components and I need to do the snapshot test too, should I do them all? Yeah, why not? Definitely, you should snapshot test anything that you want. Anything that's could potentially change, or that could potentially change as a result of a bug. For sure. Okay. So I do have a moderator. TL's moderating some of these questions. So if I don't get to your question right now, I'll go through all of them after the lecture and see if I can get through the unanswered ones. How do you test values passed as arguments? Was having trouble figuring this out. I don't know what you mean exactly. If you're just unit testing, then you just call the function with the arguments and you unit test the argument, right? So in this wait function, it takes 2 arguments, right? It takes seconds and callback. When we call the wait function, when we test it, we simply just pass the arguments, right? We just call the function normally, and then we test against the output. So if you want to test arguments, you just write a test that actually calls the function and passes the arguments. How do we test something that depends on state in another component? You just have to move further up the component tree. So you'd have to write your selectors so they select elements that are higher up in the component tree, and then you can compare it from there. Okay, if I'm understanding your question correctly. All right, let's jump into a quick review before we get started. I know testing is frustrating. It takes a long time to get it down, to get comfortable with it. Don't freak out if you're not comfortable with it yet. Just give yourself some time, and once you start working on something that actually depends on testing, and you you have time to actually go write and you debug your tests, then you're going to see how much it's actually worth it to write tests. Okay, quick review. So explain to me really quick what snapshot testing is. How would you explain snapshot testing? Yasir, that's a good point. Let me address that after this. So snapshot testing is literally just automating the process of taking a screenshot and comparing the two screenshots, right? It takes a JSON representation of your component tree, compares it to new JSON representations later down the line. When are snapshot tests impractical to use? Or impractical to write, I guess. During active development, right? When we have a lot of stuff that's changing often. Our components are still kind of in their development phase and they're changing often, and our snapshot tests are going to constantly be failing. So we don't really want to write snapshot tests until stuff has kind of settled down, changes have started to settle down. I like what Yasir asked. He asked the problem that he has and several other people is that they have no idea what needs to be tested. How do we decide, like when we're writing tests, how do we decide what actually needs to be tested? What do you guys think? It kind of depends on the test type, right? If we're talking unit tests, you're obviously just going to test the functionality of a function. You're going to pass in all the expected parameters and then compare them against the expected outputs, right? That's pretty straightforward as to what you're testing. But when we talk integration testing, what should we actually be testing? And even like end-to-end testing. Okay, yeah, so we're testing a couple different things. We're testing for, well, I guess we're essentially testing just for any kind of user input or any kind of element that's being displayed to the user on the screen, right? We're kind of just simulating a real person looking at our screen and clicking around, making sure text is where it's supposed to be, making sure buttons are displaying the right text, making sure putting text into an input like updates the actual input. Pretty much anything that's on our page that you can see with your own eyes. Those are the kind of stuff that's the kind of things that we want to test for. Okay, we're virtualizing that process of looking at the screen. So we're just taking this test runner, we're saying, all right, go look at that button. Does that button look okay? All right, move on. Go put some text in that input field. Does that work okay? Go make that API call. Does it come back with expected results? So you just kind of have to think of it from a user perspective, right? You kind of have to just simulate a user experience on your application, and that's kind of what you should be testing for. All right. What's a mock? How would you explain a mock? Lying to the app. Yeah, mocks are essentially allow us to fake real services and libraries, right? They allow us to fake API endpoints. We can fake libraries like Axios. We can override functions like the set timeout. It basically allows us to hijack any kind of functionality that we don't have direct control over and control it, right? Control it with our own outputs, our own return values. And that's useful because we don't always want to call real resources. We don't want to call the dog API every single time our test suite runs. Right? If we're running our tests 500 times a day, we don't want to call the dog API 500 times every day. Right? We want to fake that interaction so we don't actually make that call and we have more control over the results. What about a SPY? How would you explain a SPY? What is a SPY within the context of testing? Okay, SPYs are literally just functions that we can kind of stock, right? Functions that we can spy on throughout their life cycle. So we can kind of follow them around. We can see what they're up to. We can see when they're being called, what they're being called with, how many times they're being called. It's useful if you want to create a function that you want to make sure something happens to that function somewhere down the line, that callback function, right? Maybe you want to make sure it just gets called by some function deeper in the app. Maybe you want to make sure it gets called with a specific parameter, right? You can kind of just follow it around and make sure certain things happen to it. It's very, very useful for certain types of testing. Okay, and then a stub. Does anybody remember what a stub is? We didn't really talk about that too much during the last lecture. A stub is actually just an existing function that we turn into a SPY. Okay, it's like a CIA field officer goes out and recruits spies, right? And he recruits agents. We're taking these existing functions and we're converting them over to SPY for us. That's a stub. All right, well, I know testing was a struggle. You guys have done an extremely good job at it. I've been very impressed. You will get into it a lot more in backend. So if you're still struggling with it right now, just hang on. And once you get into backend, I think it'll make a lot more sense when you don't have to worry about testing within the context of React. You can just focus on testing pure code. So yeah, stick with it. Yeah, and absolutely. Thanks for everyone that shared resources, shared links and tutorials. That's really how you're going to learn. Right? We can only do so much as Lambda. I know sometimes the training kit material isn't great, and I can only do so much as an instructor in 2 hours. So really, if you're struggling with stuff, you should be going out there and you should be looking for links and looking for tutorials and watching videos and just absorbing all of these different resources so that you can learn what you're trying to learn. Okay, one of the developer's best skills is to learn how to Google stuff. So get really good at Googling stuff, figuring out how to find answers, because you're going to be Googling stuff throughout the entirety of your career. I still Google stuff every day. All right. Authentication, client-side authentication. Make sure you clone down the project that I posted in the PT8 channel and get your npm install going so that we can have it ready when we dive in. It's just that client-side auth library. Someone asked real quick, Bradley, you mentioned stubs. How do we make a function into a stub? Good question. You're going to have to read through the Jest documentation for that. I can point you in the right direction. You don't have to fork it, literally. You can just clone it down. You can fork it if you want. It's up to you. All right, so authentication is actually a really interesting topic. The rabbit hole with authentication goes really deep, and a lot of people actually dedicate their entire careers to authentication. Luckily, as a front-end developer, we don't have to worry too much about the implementation until you get to the back end. Once you get to the back end sprints, you can start worrying more about the implementation of authentication and worrying how to like set it up and how to store passwords and things like that. But as a front-end developer, we don't have to worry about that. Okay, we're just consuming these existing authentication services. So for now, all we need to know is how to consume those authentication services on the client side with React. This is actually really, really easy. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to learn how to consume an existing authentication service with React. So authentication, actually, it just comes down to really one thing. When you hear the word authentication, it can refer to a lot of different stuff, but it really just comes down to proving who we are to an external service. Right? Somehow proving that we are who we say we are to an external service. Whether that's an API or whether that's like Google or Facebook or some kind of external service. So what's the first step when you hear proving who you are to an external service? What's the first step that comes to mind as to how we prove who we are? What do you think? First step of proving who we are to a service. It's logging in, right? That's the first step that we take in order to prove who we are to a service that we've already signed up for, I guess just to say. It's logging in, right? We send our username and our password, our email and password, and we say, this is who we are, this is my password. Verify me, right? So most of the time before we can log in, before we can verify who we are, or before we can tell the server who we are, we have to introduce ourselves to that service, right? Which is signing up for a new account. So these are kind of the first two steps of authentication, just thinking about it as a whole, like from a higher level, right? We introduce ourselves to a service by signing up for a new account. We say, this is my email, this is my name, this is who I am. Okay, nice to meet you. And then later on down the line, the server doesn't really trust anybody, right? So we have to prove to the server who we are. We have to prove that we are who we say we are by giving them a username and a password. Right? We say, this is who I am. If my password is correct, then I am who I say I am. Okay, so now most of the time, servers don't remember anything about us after each request. Okay, even if we previously logged in at a previous time, on a new request, the server's not going to remember that. It's going to treat us as a stranger every single time we come back. Okay, unless we remind it who we are by sending some kind of identifier with every single request. Okay, the server has no memory of who we are. It's very unforgiving. It's very untrusting. So we have to prove who we are every time we go back to the server. It's not going to remember us. So we could just send, anytime we communicate with that server, we could prove who we are every single time by just sending our username and password every time, right? That would be an option, but what's the problem with this approach? What do you think the problem with the approach is of just sending our username and password every single time we want to tell the server who we are? Okay, so not dry, annoying, cumbersome, decreased security, time, dangerous, not user-friendly. All right answers, yep. Or just use Face ID, Cliff. Yeah, so essentially, well, first of all, it would be kind of insecure to to store your unencrypted plain text password anywhere on your computer. Like if you were to store your password in local storage or in a cookie, that would be very insecure, right? Because anybody that got access to your computer would then have your password, right? Just in plain text. Maybe you use the same password that you do. Maybe you go create an account on your app and use the same password that you use to log into your bank account, right? And someone gets access to that password because it's just sitting on your disk. They can now go log into your bank account, right? You can see the problem. Passwords are very sensitive information, not just for the app that you're working with, but for apps outside of your scope. Because most people use the same password for everything. So that's the first thing. It would be very insecure and risky to store that anywhere on your disk, right? Even in local storage. But if we don't store it on the disk, if we don't store that password somewhere and we still have to pass it up every time, you would have to ask the user to re-log in on every single request, right? And imagine what kind of user experience nightmare that would be. Imagine you were on Facebook and anytime you clicked on anything, went anywhere, you'd have to retype your username and password in. Okay, that would be a nightmare. Obviously not a good solution. So the way that most servers solve this problem is with things called authentication tokens. All right, an authentication token. Essentially, we are exchanging our username and our password one time during login, right? During that login process, we're exchanging our username and our password for an authentication token, which is really just like a big chunk of cryptic text. Like it really doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but the server understands what it is, okay? And then we store that token locally on our computer using local storage or cookies or something like that. And then on any subsequent requests to the server, we attach that token as a header to the request. Okay, and then the server can tell based on some really complicated cryptography methods, it can tell whether or not it was the one that actually issued that token and whether it's still valid or not and whether it's been like tampered with. Okay, so if it receives this token and it's not valid or it can tell that it's been messed with a little bit, then the user is then considered unauthenticated and they have to go log back in to get a new token. Okay, so that's how we solve this problem of not requiring users to log in over and over and over again, is through authentication tokens. Just these big blobs of really confusing looking text that the server gives us when we log in, and then we just send that back every time we want to prove who we are. So we have to remind the server who we are after logging in. And we send that token as a header along with our API call. So who remembers what a header is? Does anybody remember what a header is? This is a header. Maybe in like England, they call helmets headers there. What's a header? Do we remember? We covered it very briefly in one of our previous lectures. Do you remember this diagram? This is the structure of an HTTP call, right? The HTTP protocol, kind of how the internet works behind the scenes. So anytime we go to our browser and we make a request, or anytime we use Axios to make a request, it's going to send a request to the URL that we specify, right? And it's going to specify a request method, whether it's GET or POST. It's going to specify a URL. And then it's going to specify some headers and maybe a body. Okay, the headers are essentially just metadata about the request. Right? It allows you to attach some information to your request without putting it in the body of the request. Right? Because maybe your body is going to be different a lot of times. You might, if you're creating a new user, your body is going to contain user information. If you're maybe liking something on Facebook, your body is going to create information about the post that you're liking, right? But for every single one of those requests, you're going to have to send an authorization header. Right? You're going to have to send that authentication token that we got back when we logged in. So no matter what the body is, no matter what the request type is, we still want to send that token. And that's why we use headers, because headers can kind of just be metadata about the request, about any request. Okay. And then remember the server, when it responds, it's going to respond with a status code, and it's going to respond with more headers, right? Sometimes the server responds with some metadata that the browser needs, and then it's going to respond with a body as well. All right, so headers are actually really easy to send with Axios, and we'll see how to do that a little bit later. But essentially, it's convention to, when we're sending an authentication token that we receive back when we log in, if we're sending one of those tokens as a header to an API, it's convention to call the header authorization. So you see a lot of these headers, they have different names. You have this host header. Host header has a value of localhost 5000. User agent header has a value of curl. Accept header has that value. If we were making an authenticated request, you'd have another header here in this request that would be authorization. So it would look like, you'd have something that was like authorization and then some token. Sometimes it's called authorization. Sometimes you'll see like X auth token. Sometimes you'll see, I don't know, it depends on the service that you're using, but most of the time it's just going to be authentication, or not authentication, authorization. I think I kept saying authorization. All right. Questions so far? So explain to me really quick, repeat back to me what the general flow of this method of authentication looks like from the user perspective or from the client perspective. What does it look like? Map it out for me. Give me the TLDR, the too long didn't read of what we just said. Okay. Ruth hit it out of the park. This is the too long didn't read of everything that we just said so far. Okay, the user logs in. It's the first step. Maybe you could prelude that with the user signs up for an account. Okay. User needs to register for a new account, introduce themselves to the service, to the API. Say, nice to meet you. My name is Jason. Give me an account. All right. A lot of times that process in and of itself of signing up for an account, that will return an authentication token. But sometimes it won't, and sometimes you have to log in after you do that. So once you introduce yourself, then the server is going to store that information about you in a database somewhere, right? It's going to store your name, it's going to store your email, it's going to store your password. And then the user is going to log in. Okay, they're going to say, I need an authentication token to go access this private resource. Okay, give me an authentication token. Here's my username. Here's my password. Verify that it's actually me. And the server is going to say, okay, He takes the username and the password, he looks them up in the database, he makes sure that the password is correct, that it matches what was given when he signed up. If everything's good to go, then he says, all right, cool, I trust you. Here's an authentication token. Have fun, right? Maybe the password's incorrect and you don't get that authentication token. Server kind of halts and it says, you can't go any further. You're not who you actually say you are. But let's say the user then gets the authentication token, okay? And maybe the client's gonna store that like in local storage, or it's gonna store it somewhere in the browser, somewhere that it can be accessed over and over again, that persists. It doesn't just delete when you close your browser. Okay, and then anytime the client now wants to access a private resource, we've already been pre-authenticated, so we already have that token. Anytime we want to access a private resource, we just pass that authentication token along with our request. Okay. Say we want to access information about our account. That's obviously private, not anybody can access that. But we're going to pass along our authentication token and say, this is who I am. I've already been authenticated and this token is valid. And the server is going to say, great, cool, here's your account information. It's going to let them through. Okay, and that process happens every single time you access a private resource. The server verifies your authentication token. Okay, that's the overall flow of this form of authentication that we're going to talk about, or that we're going to implement. So Nick, question, when we send back the token, is it convention to send it back stringified and then in our Axios with auth parse it? So the authentication token is just a string. It's not an object or anything like that. It's literally just a string that's pre-encoded by the server. So the server just gives you a string and then we just pass that string up to the server. We don't actually use it in the client-side application other than just passing it back when we need to. Good question. All right, so this is just one method of authentication. There's obviously many more that would work better for different situations. Maybe you build an application and you want to use a managed authentication service like Auth0 or Firebase or one of these other services. You could totally do that. But then that process is going to be a little bit different. Sometimes it'll be the same, but there's a lot of different authentication methods. This one that we just talked about, this is what we're going to implement tonight. Yeah, yep, Dennis, auth 0, number 0. All right, so let's jump into the project. Let's implement this. We're actually not talking about a lot of new stuff tonight. We're bringing together a lot of stuff that we've learned in the past, a lot of our current knowledge. So tonight's project is going to be fun. I think you'll enjoy it. We're essentially just going to implement the entire auth flow that we just talked about with a login page and a protected route that you can only access when you're logged in. And we're going to just interface with a pre-built server that gives us an authentication token. And then if we have time, we'll implement a sign-up form. So please try to follow along tonight. I know sometimes it's easy to just watch me code and do it afterwards, but it would be very helpful to understand the whole concept tonight if you follow along. Like I said, we're bringing together a lot of previous knowledge and putting it to use. So we're actually not going to use Redux if you're still feeling kind of scared about Redux, because we don't have a lot of components that we're going to build, so we don't really need to use it. We're just going to use regular state. But if you're feeling daring, you can try and implement it with Redux later if you want. Venki, we are not in Code Sandbox. We are working from this project right here. So make sure you get it cloned down, do an npm install, and then cd and get into the directory and get ready to go. Okay, So notice how our project, let's walk through it really quick. This thing is driving me crazy. I have to keep it on. Just keeps going to the side. So notice that this project, it has an API folder. This is the kind of stuff that you're going to implement in a couple weeks when you get into the back end. This is a pre-written backend in Node, if you want to poke through it a little bit. But we can start this server. So once you get it cloned down and npm installed, you can just type npm run start-api. Okay, so not npm start, npm run start-api. And that's going to start our API for us and run it locally. Okay. So run that, you should see this message that says server running at localhost port 8080. And now, so this is kind of tricky, but you need to open a new tab in your terminal. So Command T, Control T, or a new window if you're in a different terminal. Open up a new tab. Go back into your project folder and type npm start. So that will start your React application. So we're going to run our Node API in one tab on port 8080, and then our React application in another tab on port 3000. So we're essentially running two different things here. So is port 8080 different from the 5000 we've done before? So we just have two different services running here. Right? We have our React application that's running like normal. In my case, it's running on port 3000. But we also have to run another service. We have to run our API so that our React app can make requests to that API. So it can make an Axios call. And so it just has to run it on a different port. It doesn't really matter what port it runs on, as long as two services aren't running on the same port. Okay, so now you'll see if we go into our browser, we go to localhost 3000, that's going to be our React app. You should see welcome. And then if you open up a new tab in your browser and you go to localhost port 8080, you should see a response from our API, which is some JSON data that says message welcome. So we can now use Axios from our React app to make a request to this server to get some data. All right, give me a thumbs up when you're ready to go, when you have your server running and your React app running. Yep, you do need to npm install, Sarah. Anytime you clone down a project from GitHub and it has a package.json, you need to run npm install. We've done this several times already. You should know how to get a React app running locally, hopefully. Yeah, until you run into some strange error. All right, let's jump into it. So our first step is we are going to implement the sign-in route. Okay, so we're going to implement a sign-in page or a login page, whatever you want to call it. So I guess while we're setting everything up, we can also jump into our project and we need to install two dependencies. Okay, so we're going to npm install Axios, obviously, because we need to make Axios calls. And then we need to also install React Router. So React Router DOM. Those are the only two dependencies that we're going to have tonight. So I'm going to install those two. Yeah, good point, Tara. That's why I wanted everyone to get this started before the lecture began so that we could be ready to go. You can do the -- save if you want, Cliff. It does it automatically now. NPM will automatically save it for you. Okay, so let's implement our sign-in route, shall we? First things first, let's get React Router installed in our app. So who remembers how to install React Router? All right, good, Nick. We're going to import browser router. You can say as router if you want to reassign the variable. That's not necessary, though. You can just import browser router from React Router DOM. Okay. And then, good, Cliff, we need to wrap app in the router component. So let's wrap our app component in browser router. Okay, just like that. Anything else that we need to do? Nope, that's it. React's now installed, or React Router is now installed. Import Redux if you're using Redux. We're not going to use Redux tonight. So unless you feel the need to, you don't have to. Now let's jump into app.js. Let me split this up. Jump into app.js. And let's implement some routes. Okay, what do we need to do to define a route? We're going to import something from React Router DOM. A ding, we can input or import link. We're going to need that at some point. And route, good. We also need route. So import link and route from React Router DOM. Inside of our wrapper, let's get rid of this H1. We're going to replace it with navigation. So let's create some nav, just a nav tag. And let's just create a link to our home route. So we can say link to / give it some text of home. All right, now let's define a new route. So just like Danny says, we can say route, use that route component that we imported. We're going to say exact to match the path that we give it exactly. And the path, let's say sign in. Okay, and then we have to give it some kind of a component, right? Let's create that component, the sign in component. So let's create a new file in our components folder. We'll create a new file, and we're going to call it signin.js. Okay, do the default, the regular boilerplate React stuff. So import React from React. I'm going to say function sign in. The props parameter, it's going to return some JSX. And then we can export default sign in. Okay, now we can jump into app and we can import that component. So we can import sign in from /sign in or /components /sign in. And then use that as the component for our React route. Let's say component. Or not component, sorry, sign in. Okay, let's return something from our sign in component. Maybe just a form tag. So let's return form. Oh, good point, Oksana. Yeah, I actually didn't notice that. Yeah, good catch. It's not /components, it's just /sign in since this is already in the components folder. And Leslie, yeah, great catch. Thank you. Yeah, you guys make me so proud. You've come so far. I love it. All right, let's, so we were returning a form tag. Let's put some inputs in here for our form. So let's do an input of type text. And we can say name is email. We're going to log in with an email and a password, right? So we can say name email, placeholder email, and close it up. And then do the same thing with a password field. So you can copy that. You can say type equals password, name equals password, and placeholder equals password. You can actually change the type of the email field. There's an email type now. So if you want to say type email, you can do that as well. And then maybe a submit button. So we can say button type equals submit. And maybe we can just say sign in. Now, what do we need to do to make our input fields controlled? We need to put on changes on each of them, right? And values stored in state. Good. So let's import use state, React. Let's set up some initial state for this form. Do you think it's better to do a single value for each input field, or should we do an object in our state? What do you think? Danielle says object. Bradley says single values. Okay, object. Everyone wants to do an object. Let's do an object. Sorry, Bradley. So let's say const. We'll call it data, set data equals use state. And then we need to give it an initial value. initial object value, right? And we can define email as a blank string and password as a blank string. Yep, using an object does make it easier when we make our request because we can just pass the object, right? We don't have to construct a new object. And then we need a handle change function for those inputs, right? So we can, yep, it does make it cleaner depending on how many input fields you have. Since we only have 2, I guess it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But if we had a lot, then using an object would definitely be cleaner. So now we can define a handle change function. We can say const handle change. It's just going to be a function that takes an event Good, ding. Yep, we need to take the target name and the target value and use that to assign new state. We don't need to prevent default on this one, Oksana, because the input field doesn't have any default behavior that we need to prevent. Maybe if this was a button, yeah, but not an input field. Totally fine. So let's set some new state. We can say set data. We're going to pass a new object. How do we make this object immutable? How do we use an immutable object for our new state? We need to spread it, right? Good. So we can say dot, dot, dot data and pass in the new value. We're going to assign the key value of event.target.name. And we're going to assign it the value of event.target.value. Nice. And last step here, we need to attach these values and the handle change function to each one of our inputs. So we can just say value equals, for email, we can say value equals data email, and on change equals handle change. Then you can copy those 2 props and assign them to the password field as well. And change, for password, you can change data.email to, you guessed it, data.password. Nice, it's looking good. Save everything, and let's see if it worked. All right, so we have a home link. I guess we should also have a sign-in link, right? We forgot to add that. So let's add a link, another link to our nav, say to sign in. And the text can be sign in. Let's see if that works. Click on sign in and you should see your sign in form. Type in the fields. Should be good to go. That's the benefit of using a type email. It outlines as red if you don't put it in real email address. Cool. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Let everyone catch up, and I'll see you in 5. Okay, come on back. That's actually an interesting error, Kyle. I've never seen that before. You could just try renaming event to EVT or E. I'm not sure why it would prevent you from using the keyword of event. It's strange. Okay, looks like most of you got your errors figured out, mostly just typos. Cool. All right, let's move on, shall we? Let's add a, so sometimes our API is going to come back with an error message. Let's just foreshadow that and add in some kind of an error component or error tag. So let's add a new piece of state, since this is not really related to the form data, but just something else in the component. We can say const error and set error equals use state, and it doesn't need a default. And then inside of our component, inside of that same component, we can now, right above the input fields, let's just write a simple ternary that says if error exists, if there's something in there that's not undefined, then show a div, the class name of error, and display the error. Should be bringing back some memories of our fun times with forms. All right, now we need another thing. We need to add a, what else do we need to add to this component? We need a handle submit function, right? Nice. And then inside of the handle submit, we need to make an Axios call. So let's define a handle submit function. It's going to take an event. And this one we do need to prevent default, Oksana, because it has default behavior of refreshing the page, right? We don't want that to happen. So let's event dot default. And now we need to make a Axios call in here. So let's jump up to the top and let's import Axios from Axios. Yep, totally understandable. No worries. Let's make an Axios post call. So if you poked around in the API a little bit, you'll see that there's some different endpoints. There's the welcome endpoint, which is just the root. There's a sign up endpoint, which accepts some data to create a new account. There's a sign in endpoint, which allows us to trade our credentials for a token. And then there's a /me endpoint, which will return the details of your user account. Okay, that's it. Those 4 endpoints. So let's make a post request to that sign in endpoint and pass our credentials and see what it comes back with. We can say axios.get. And the URL, if you remember when we started the server, is http localhost port 8080. And then our endpoint is going to be sign in. Okay, and now we need to pass some data, right? Because a post or a, oh, I'm sorry, this is supposed to be a post request, not a get request. My mistake. This is a post request to sign in because we're sending data. So what data do we need to send? to our endpoint. Just data, right? Just data. Very easy. That's why we put all of our state in that one object. So now we can just send the data object. Boom, done. That's now going to send our email and password as a post request to the sign-in endpoint. And let's see what it comes back with. So we're going to do a .then. It's going to return a result, some kind of result, and a .catch if it returns an error. Call this error, if we're already using error up here. Okay, if we get an error, we need to do what with it? We need to use that setter function, right? We can set error. And remember, Axios, when it returns an error, it actually comes back in the form of error.response.data. And then this API specifically that we're running returns a message for an error. So we can say .data.message if there's an error. Remember, that response structure, the structure of data is going to be different depending on the API that you're using. For this specific case, it returns a key called message. And then let's just log out, console log our result.data, the data that came back from the endpoint. Yeah, yep, we implemented the error first before the then. So let's run this and see what that endpoint returns when we send it some data. So jump back into the browser. Oh, whoops, handle submit. See, we got a warning, handle submit is assigned a value but never used. We forgot to attach that to the form. Good catch, Vlad. So we need to say on submit equals handle submit. Sometimes those error messages are very helpful. Let's try that. Okay, make sure your console is open. Make sure your inspector tools are open with your console. First, just try signing in without anything, see what happens. The API comes back and it says invalid email or password. Okay, we're not authenticated. Try typing in something. Try typing in jane@doe.com with the password of hello. Hit sign in. Same error, right? Invalid email or password. This API specifically is actually pre-saved with an account called jane@doe.com, and the password is ABC123. So try using those credentials and see what happens. jane@doe.com and ABC123. Hit sign in. Look at that. We got something kind of interesting. The error didn't go away because we haven't implemented that yet. But we got this token back from the server. This long, weird looking string. Okay, this is the authentication token. The server accepted our username and our password. It said, all right, I believe who you are. I'm going to generate this authentication token. I'm going to give it to you. And then you can use it as a reminder as to whether or not you actually are who you say you are. You can use it to remind me that I believed you when you logged in. Okay, we now have that token. So what should we do with it? We have it. We have it in our response object. What should we do with it? We need to save it somewhere, right? Because if we want to send this on subsequent requests, we have to save it somewhere that we can retrieve it. So let's save it to local storage because local storage is the easiest way. You could use a cookie and it will kind of have the same effect, but we're going to use local storage. Danny asked a question, is local storage better than cookies for storing auth tokens? There are differences, okay? Local storage is easier to work with, but cookies come with a little bit more functionality. And we're actually not going to cover cookies in the lecture. So if you want to learn about cookies, go read up on them. But more often than not, nowadays, local storage is used over cookies. Yep, cookies are a little less secure, but they can provide a lot of additional functionality. They're both just methods to store stuff locally in the browser. Okay. So if we want to store this token that we got back from our API call, if we want to store that in local storage, we've done this before. All you have to do is just say local storage dot set item, and we're going to set the item under the key of token, and we're going to pass through result.data.token. You can take out the console log. All right, that's all it takes. Now we're going to store that token in local storage, and it's going to persist. So save that, and then go back and try and log in again. If you're in Firefox, you can go to the storage tab. In Chrome, I believe it's the application tab, and go view your local storage for the site. Currently, we don't have anything. Well, actually, we have some values left over from our dog app, but you can delete those. So we don't have anything currently in our local storage, right? Now try typing jane@doe.com and abc123. Hit sign in. And look at that, our token is now stored in local storage. And that is there until we delete it. Okay, refresh the page. You'll see that token is still there. Close the tab and open up the tab again, or close the browser and go to the site. Open up your console again. Still there. Okay, you could shut off your computer, unplug it, come back in a year, and that value is still going to be there. Okay, so now we can take that and we can post it up, or we can send it up as a header to any authorized requests or any requests that require authorization. All right, Ruth, you're getting an unauthorized error. Let's see. Looks right. Maybe you just need to, maybe you need to make sure you're typing the correct credentials. Yeah, if someone can jump in there and help Ruth look over her code, maybe there's something, some typo. Yeah, that's the thing, Rose, is you actually, local storage, it's based on the domain name. Since we've used localhost with our dog API that use local storage as well, you might see some leftover values in the local storage from the dog API, from the dog website. Okay, then can you remember to ask your questions in Slido? I've been giving you guys a little bit of slack with, no pun intended, but with Slack. But I would prefer official questions to go in Slido so they don't get lost. Okay, let me post all this code up for you real quick so that you don't get left behind. This is index.js. This is components/signin.js. And this is components/app.js. Slido is good for those that have more than one screen. Well, you don't have to monitor it. You don't have to keep it open. You can just keep the tab open, keep the tab available, and then when you have a question, just jump into it and ask. You don't have to actually keep it open. Okay, so now we need to send that. Now that we have that token stored in local storage, we essentially have to send it as a header for any subsequent requests. Okay, so we could do this one of two ways. We can go into every single Axios request and we can send a third parameter that has our headers value. And we can say authorization and local storage dot get item token. But that's verbose. That's kind of verbose code. We don't have to we don't want to have to redefine that every time we make an Axios call, right? So let's do this somewhere else. We're not going to do it in this file. We're going to create a new file. Actually, we're going to create a new folder. If you create a new folder in source and call it utils for utilities, and then inside of that utils folder, we're going to create a new file and we're going to call it api.js. api.js. And inside of API, we can kind of abstract that Axios call so that we can define that authorization header on every single one of the Axios calls versus just specifically the one. So we are only using it right now, but we're going to use Axios a couple more times throughout our application. We don't want to have to redefine our headers. So let's jump into the API and we're going to import Axios as the first thing. Remember, this isn't React. This has nothing to do with React. This is just a JavaScript file, just a JavaScript utility. So we're not going to deal with React. We're not dealing with JSX. We're just creating a helper function. So let's export the default function of the file. Just define it as a function. And then we're going to return something called axios.create. And it's going to take an object. This is creating essentially an instance of Axios that has some predefined values on it. So instead of calling like axios.get or axios.post, you're going to call the result of this function .post or .get. And it will be an instance of Axios with some predefined values. So let's predefine, we can predefine the base URL so we don't have to keep saying HTTP localhost 8080. A base URL of HTTP localhost port 8080, and then we're never going to have to redefine that. And we can also attach some headers to this Axios instance. So we can say headers to send a custom header, and we're going to call it authorization, like we talked about. And the value is just going to be local storage get item of token. Okay, this is a really useful helper function. So now let's go back into submit or into sign in. And instead of calling axios.post in our handle submit, instead of doing that, instead of importing Axios, let's import API from /utils/API. So now we're importing that helper function, right? And we can now use that in place of Axios. Instead of saying axios.post, we can say API, and it's a function, so call it as a function, .post. And now that is now using a predefined, essentially a predefined version of Axios with the base URL already set, with the authorization header already set, and it's good to go. Okay, we don't need to use the authorization header in this request because it's getting the token, right? So that might be null, but that's okay. You can provide headers that aren't used by the server. So it's better for us to try and send up the authorization header on every single request instead of doing it specifically for some of them. We're just going to send it on all of them. All right, we are on our way. So Danny, I answered your question. Can you explain one more time what exactly is token? Token is the authentication token that's returned from the server. We exchange our username and our password, or our email and password, for a token. It's just a string that defines, it's a cryptographically defined string that says we are who we say we are. How do certain websites work that require you to log in after you are inactive for a certain amount of time? That's a good question. So when the server generates this authentication token, it can decide if it expires after a certain amount of time. So it can say, I'm going to generate this token, but after 6 hours, then it's no longer valid. Okay, and then the server is no longer going to validate it after 6 hours, and you'll be required to log in again. Okay, in this specific instance, that's how that would happen. I see that the token changes every time I hit sign in, but after implementing the local storage, the token stays the same. I'm not sure what you mean. Every time a token is generated, it's going to be different, a little bit different, based on the methods that it uses to generate, because it uses the timestamp as part of the generation. But once you store it, then that's the one that you're actually using, so it's not going to change unless you relog in again. Will it ever be necessary to purposely remove items from local storage rows? Yes. And we'll cover one of those reasons in just a minute. But if you ever need to remove that token from the local storage, then yeah, there are instances when you would need to do that. In API.js, can we also declare other parameters? Yes. So you can declare base URL, headers, whatever you want. Read through the Axios documentation, and they give you a breakdown of what you can actually use. Bradley, shouldn't the API.post URL be /signin because we defined a base URL? Yep, good catch. We now no longer have to say that URL. We can just say /signin. I was so excited about creating the helper that I forgot to actually use it. Getting type error, cannot read data, property data of undefined. Try logging it out. Maybe result is undefined. Try logging out result and see what is there. Is there a way to track inactive users? That goes beyond the scope of this lecture. But yes, there are ways. You'll probably get into some of that when you get into backend. That's not a stupid question. It's just an advanced question that's not technically in the scope of this right now. All right. Now let's create our account page. Our account page that actually uses a protected endpoint. Okay, so let's create a new file in components. We're going to call it account.js. All right, same deal. Import React from React, and create a function called account. Some props. I'm going to return some JSX and export default account. You've typed this so many times now, you should be able to just fly through it. It should be muscle memory. Okay, let's return, maybe we just return a fragment, so just an empty tag. And let's return an H1. We can say my account because this is our account page. And then let's create a div. I have a class name called account-row I can use. And then inside of that, let's say name is going to be the value of some user.name. And then do that same thing for email. So we're going to display the name and the email of the user that's currently logged in. All right, now we need to get that user value from somewhere, right? That's currently undefined. So let's first create some initial state for it. So we're going to import useState from React. And we're going to define const user and set user equals useState and an object with email or with name and email. And then we need to make our Axios request, right? Where should we make our Axios request? Yes, yep. Change second name to email, thank you. How should we make our Axios request? Remember that we have to make a GET request to that /me endpoint. So we should, good thing. Let's do it in a use effect. So let's import use effect. And let's create a side effect. So use effect, it's going to take a callback and an empty dependency array because we only want it to run when the page initially loads. Okay, good, Nick. We need to import our API helper, right? So we can say import API from /utils/API. And let's make that Axios call. Just by saying API, we're going to call it as a function. And we're going to say .get /me. So it's going to make a GET request to /me. But here's the cool part. Since we already have a token stored in our local storage, it's going to attach that as a header to that request, and it's going to validate it for us. So we don't have to do anything extra to validate that network request. Okay, then we can do a .then. It's going to get a result, and the .catch will get an error. Let's just log out the error if we get one. We don't have to display it here. We probably should, but we're running out of time. What should we do with our result? Set user, right? So let's set user. We're going to set an object. We could just say set user result.data, but we're not entirely sure what result.data is going to contain. So let's specifically say set name to result.data.name and email to result.data.email. The endpoint might return some other stuff that we don't necessarily care about, and we don't want to accidentally set that to state too. So let's specifically say name and email. All right, save that. Now go into your app.js and let's create a link and a route for it. So you can import account from account. Let's set up a link for it. So we can say link to /account. Maybe call it my account. And set up a route. We can say route exact path equals account. Component equals account. Which file rows? They're both already at the top. All right, now try logging in with Jane Doe. Password ABC123. Well, first try deleting the token. You can delete the token from local storage just by highlighting it and pressing the backspace key. And try going to my account, see what happens. Go to my account and look at the console. We get a request failed with status code 403. Okay, if you look at the network request, the actual request, you'll see the server returned with message, invalid authentication token. Okay, we're not sending that token yet because we don't have it. Right, if yours worked, that's probably because you didn't delete your token from local storage. So there's no token, it's not sending up a token, and the server's gonna say, you don't have a token, you're not authorized to view this endpoint. So let's try signing in. Sign in with jane@doe.com. Password ABC123. Hit sign in. Saves the token. Now go to my account. And you see it now pulls down our account data. If you look at the network request that it actually made, this GET request, you see it passed a header automatically for us. Our request headers include an authorization with our long, crazy auth token. And the server validated that, and it believes who we say we are, and it responded with our user data. All right, let's take a 4-minute break. Give you a chance to catch up and fix anything that's not working. See you in 4 minutes. Okay, how's everyone feeling? Errors? It's combining the localhost URLs. All right, make sure you have all your slashes in the correct places. That's usually the culprit when you have weird URLs coming together. So make sure you're prefixing your endpoint with a slash, and make sure your API helper does not have a trailing slash. Make sure you have your double slashes with HTTP. Make sure you have your colon. Account Darren is posted right above you. I posted it right in that message above. So yeah, Bradley, you asked you're getting that error where it combines the two URLs. Yeah, you want to make sure you get all of your slashes in the right place. It's usually the culprit. All right, let's move on. How does 2 hours go by so quick? I don't fully understand why our lectures go by so quick. I don't know if you guys feel like that too, but the time just like flies by. It's crazy. I think before we get started, it's like, yeah, we'll have plenty of time to cover all this stuff. And then I look at the clock and it's like, oh, you have 25 minutes left. It's strange. It's the robot head. There must be. I have a different concept of time. All right, so let's move on to the next part of this, which is disallowing the user to be on the account page if they're not currently logged in. Okay, so currently if we don't have a token, if you delete that token and you refresh your account page, it still allows you to be there, but it doesn't show anything, right? It returns an error from that endpoint. So we probably don't even want the user to be allowed to be on this page if they're not logged in. So let's create a higher order component that wraps route and essentially checks for that token. And if it doesn't exist, we'll redirect them to the sign-in page. And if it does exist, it'll just pass through the route as normal. Okay, so in our components folder, let's create a new file. We're going to call this one protected route.js. Protected route. Import React from React. Function protected route. Return export default. I should probably set up an auto typer for that, but I don't have one. All right, so we have this protected route component. We want to essentially use this in place of route for components that require the token. Okay, so let's come into, if you come into app.js and import, let's import this component, import protected route from / protected route, and use it in place of route for account, not for sign-in, but for account. So use protected route instead of route. All right, so now inside of protected route, we can kind of make it a higher order component by returning the route component, or a different component called redirect. Okay, redirect is a component that React Router gives us that allows us to redirect the user to a different endpoint. So import both of those from React Router DOM. And this code, this was in the training kit. It gets a little bit tricky. It's kind of weird to understand. So let's walk through it slowly. Essentially, we're passing through all of these props to protected route. We're passing through exact, we're passing through path and component. Those are all going to exist on this props object, right? And we want to return the route component, But instead of using component like we are down here, we want to use a render prop. If you remember render props, we want to say render equals, and it's going to be a function that returns another component. Right, and inside of this render prop, we want to say if the token is set, then return the component that got passed through that component prop, and if not, redirect them to sign in. But we also want to attach the path and exact to the route component, right? We kind of want to transparently pass those through. So we're going to use some kind of confusing, tricky destructuring syntax. We're going to say const, and we're going to destructure from props. So const object from props. And we're going to say, we're going to destructure the component prop, and we're going to rename it as component uppercase. And then we're going to do a spread, and we're going to say ... rest. Okay, I think this is the first time we've used this syntax. This destructuring. This is advanced destructuring. This is essentially saying, take this props object, remove the component value from it, and assign it to the variable name of component, and then everything else besides component stored in this variable called rest. So it's extracting this, it's essentially extracting the prop value of component from that object and putting everything else in this variable called rest. All right, so now that we do that, when we're using the route component, we can now spread the props of rest on there. Okay, the reason we do that is because we don't want to put both component and render on the route component. We only want to use one of them, right? And if we just spread props on here like that, then it's going to use both component and render. We only want to use one of them. Okay, so we're going to spread rest on there. And then render props, remember they return a value that's the render props, essentially. So you can get that from the parameters. And we can now write an if statement, and we can say if, let's say if local storage get item token. So if that token exists, then we want to return our component with the render props spread on there. Okay. Otherwise, if there's no token, then we want to return the redirect component and point the user to sign in. Okay, weird syntax, I know. But we've now created a higher order component that will redirect the user to sign in if there's no token. We can use that over and over and over again for any protected routes. Okay, and we spread render props onto that component because render props contain things that come from the router. If we were to leave that out, then component itself is not going to have access to any React Router stuff. We want it to maintain access to React Router stuff, so we spread render props on there. Okay, weird syntax. Any questions regarding that before we move on? Yes, very weird syntax indeed. Different than what we've seen. But it's once you understand what it's doing under the hood, it's still doing the same thing, right? It's just destructuring an object. But it's just kind of renaming stuff. It's renaming component to component uppercase so that we can use it as a component. And it's extracting the component value from rest so that we can spread rest onto route. Okay. Okay, specific questions. Any specific questions regarding that syntax or what we just did? Put them in Slido. Can we explain the render props part again? Yep, so render props, that's just coming from React Router, right? Those are the props that React Router gives us. Sometimes you don't use them. We're not really using them in this case, but we want to have access to them just in case. When we do this syntax and we just say component equals sign in, that automatically behind the scenes sends all of the React Router props to that component. We have access to it, like props.history and any of those React Router props. Okay, if we just leave out, if we don't spread render props on this component when we render it, it's not going to have access to any of those React Router props. But let's say a component wanted to use props.history, which comes from React Router. Well, then we'd have to send it through. We could just do them individually, and we could say like history equals render props.history, and so on and so forth for all of the React Router props. But as a shorthand, we can just say send all of the props through. And rest, rest, that is the object that, it's essentially the props object with the component value extracted. So it's everything except for the component value. Because we don't want to pass both component and render to the prop value, or to the route component, right? Just one of them. So we can't just spread props on there. We have to spread a different version of that object that doesn't include component, which is rest. All right, let's try this out. If we go into our page, oh, look at that. You see, if you try and go to my account now, it immediately kicks you out and redirects you to the sign-in page. But if we sign in, say jane@do.com, abc123, and we now have our token, then it will allow us to go to our My Account page. Pretty sweet, right? So Jesse, render props can be named whatever you want. Yes, that comes from React Router, but it's just a parameter to this callback function. You can name that Happy Halloween and then pass it through as Happy Halloween. It doesn't matter what you name it. It's just a parameter that comes through that function. Cool. Let's add one more detail. You notice when let's delete our token again. When we sign in, currently it just sits there, right? It stores our token in the local storage, but it doesn't do anything beyond that. We don't get any feedback that it was successful. What do you think the best thing would be from a user perspective to do when we successfully log in? Okay, we could show a spinner for when the process is actually happening, but after it successfully comes back, what should we do? We could show an alert, but from a user perspective, the best thing to do would be to redirect the user somewhere, right? Redirect them to the home page or redirect them to the My Account page. Essentially send them somewhere now that they're logged in, right? Send them to the dashboard or whatever the main interface is for that app. In this case, let's just send them to the My Account page. Okay, so we can just jump into sign in, the sign in component, and right after we set our local storage value, since this component is hooked up to React Router, we can call props.history.push. And that way we can programmatically redirect the user to some endpoint. So let's redirect them to /account. So they successfully log in, send them to account. Try it out. Jane@do.com, password abc123. And look at that, it redirects them to My Account and it pulls down the data. This is looking good. This is working really well. Inside protected route question, why can't we just use component? Why are we using render? Because we have to programmatically, we have to essentially return one, or we have to conditionally return a component. You can't conditionally return a component from just using component, right? Because that's just a variable. Yeah, you could do a ternary, but the reason we use a render prop is it's more, it's considered a computed value. So anytime this runs, it will recheck the local storage for a token. Okay. Cool. Yeah, let's do that, Nick. That's a good idea. Let's conditionally render the sign-in links and the My Account links as to whether or not you're signed in or not. If you're already signed in, you don't want to see the sign-in link. And if you're not signed in, you don't want to see the My Account link. Okay, how should we do that? What we could do, maybe in the idea of clean code, if we jump into the API utility helper, let's export a new function and call it getToken. And then from getToken, we can return local storage.getItem token. And that way we don't have to keep repeating that code, right? Instead of saying that, we can just say getToken. And then from getToken, we can return local storage.getItem token. So now we can import getToken from API, import it inside of app. Bring this up here. We can now import getToken from /utils/API or .. Maybe we can create a variable inside of this component. We can say a const signed in. Are you signed in or not? And it's whether or not there's a token. Right? We could even force this to be a Boolean, and we could say Boolean getToken, or just consider it a truthy value or a falsy value. And then for our links, we can say if you're signed in, or if you're not signed in, then show the sign-in link. Okay, if you are signed in, then show the My Account link. So we're now conditionally showing these links based on whether or not there's a token, whether or not we're signed in. See, so now we're signed in, we have a My Account, delete the token, essentially signing out. Now there's no My Account link, but just a sign in. Doesn't look like it refreshes. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now let's do one more thing with our last minute. Let's implement a logout feature. Okay, if we want to log out, right now we're just going and manually deleting that token from local storage. That's probably not the best option. If we want to automate that process with a link up at the top, how would we do that? We need to call local storage.removeItem, right? We could make a sign out link and say, if you're signed in, show a link that links to maybe log out, and the text would be log out. Then maybe we can create a new component and we can call it logout.js. This component's going to be really simple, right? All we need to do is import React from React, and we need to import redirect from React router DOM. We're going to define the function logout. Export it. Hey, how do we implement this? So, oh, Vlad already posted it. Nice. Oh, so yeah, you could do it that way, Vlad. You could programmatically just do it on the on-click for sure. In this case, we're going to use a component, but you could do it either way. There's no wrong answer. If we were using a component, it's really simple. We just need to, essentially when this component mounts, we need to say local storage dot remove item of token, right? So we're removing that item from the local storage. It's deleting it. And then we can just return a redirect. We can say redirect to maybe sign in after they log out. And then just create another protected route for that. So copy that protected route line. We can reuse that functionality, right? That protected route functionality. That's a higher order component that we can reuse as many times as we want. It comes with some powerful stuff. And we can define the endpoint as log out and the component as log out, and then make sure you import it at the top. Import log out from log out. Boom. This is a good looking app. Let's test it. Okay, we're logged in. We have a token. We have a log out link. We click it, deletes our token, and sends us to the sign-in page. Nice. Cool. That's it for tonight. We just implemented a very simple client-side authentication flow. So we can protect routes behind protected components now. We can require the user to be logged in to view specific things. This is very powerful stuff. Okay, I actually there was some other stuff I wanted to get into tonight, mostly just the create or the sign up component, but that's going to be the essentially same thing as sign in. You just have to tweak a couple of things. So if you want to do that on your own, feel free, but it's essentially going to be the same thing as this. All right, last minute questions. Someone asked inside protected route.js, why can't we just use, oh, I answered that question already. Anonymous question, what's the other way to do the conditional for if users are signed in or out? I don't know what you're asking there. So maybe instead of using get token, if you didn't want to do that helper, you could just call local storage.get item token, and it would be the same thing. This is just kind of helps us abstract that call to local storage. Okay. So protected route, is protected route a protected keyword? No, protected route is just what we called it. That's what we called our custom HOC, our higher order component. You can call it whatever you want. If you wanted to call it Happy Halloween, call it Happy Halloween. It'll still work just the same. Is logout supposed to be hidden right after the user signs out? Yes, it is. I think we have to implement one other thing to make that work. So as a last minute huzzah, we just need to wrap app in with router. So if we just import with router from React DOM, React Router DOM, and wrap app in with router, app will now re-render based on route changes. Okay, that's why it wasn't working before. But now it'll re-render based on route changes. Okay. All right. We're a little over on time, but that's okay. I'll post all of this to GitHub right after we're done here. But this is, we did some solid work today. This is a solid application. So good luck with the project. It's gonna be, you're gonna be working on auth friends. Should be a good time. And hope everyone has a great Halloween. And stick around, we have the costume contest coming up here. So if you want to try and win an Amazon gift card, stick around. Thanks, everyone.